Hello guys and welcome back to the channel. In this one we're going to be looking at an in-depth review of the skill tree after I've got, I think it's around 70 hours topside. Let me just have a look before we fully kick in player stats. 71 hours topside and of course level 75 and maxed out the skill tree. I'm going to be reviewing how I would do things slightly differently and just which notables that I think I would keep given the expedition is closing in and we have a new raider to skill out effectively. But before we kick into the full build, I just want to take a side step towards the concept of respecing. I think this is something the game needs. I think Embark need to review how and which currency we can use to do that. It doesn't need... The system, I don't believe, needs a massive overhaul. I think it's good as it is. Of course, some of the notables could change, but as you can see, after the amount of playtime I have, I'm sat with just under 2.3 million in coin currency and nearly 2,000 cred. Of course, I've already kitted out myself through the Raider deck. I have all the cosmetics from that unlocked, and I just think that it makes sense to maybe allow us to use some of this excess currency in any given season to be able to respec slightly. Even a complete skill reset might be super useful, so just thought I'd add that in there before we jump into the tree, because it's worth knowing that once you commit to a point, that's it. You can't respec in Arc Raiders in its current form, but maybe that will change in the future if you do watch this in the future. So let's kick off then with the overall build. I have conditioning 19, mobility as 20, and survival 37. Of course, the infamous security breach is the key notable on the survival tree. Definitely nerfed since I obtained it. I unfortunately wasn't a beneficiary of the pre-nerf, but again, we'll get into more detail about this notable specifically and others very, very soon. But let's kick off first of all then with Agile Croucher. I opted to go 5 out of 5 here. Maybe that's negotiable because movement speed is quite situational. And of course, while crouching as well, maybe there's been some scenarios where I've managed to stealthily catch up to Arc using crouch, and having that extra little movement speed there has helped a little bit. But honestly, I'm not sure this is noticeable enough to completely commit to it. That being said, though, in order to progress the tree, you need to have a certain amount of skill points spent. So you definitely need the 1 out of 5 to begin with. And then, of course, the additional 5 out of 5 on both of these notables, which we'll review in a bit more detail in a second, that would only take your points to 11. You still need to get 15 points before you can start taking the notables either side here. So taking the 5 out of 5 on Agile Croucher, I would say makes more sense than taking 5 out of 5 in the Revitalizing Squat. Personally, for me, stamina regeneration is a bit of a no-go area unless it's something that is kind of a secondary point to the main point of the skill, if that makes sense. So having something and stamina regeneration, or something causes you to have additional stamina regeneration, okay, we take it, right? If it's an extra point. But standalone stamina regeneration, in this case, just while crouching, I don't see the value in this personally. I think with adrenaline shots in the game, really cheap to craft, you could take 5 to 10 every loadout with you at pretty low cost, even early on into your time within a Raider's kind of journey, if we can call it that. I don't see any value here. You can just simply maximize your stamina regeneration with a adrenaline shot and get back into the business effectively straight away, right? Start sprinting, dodge rolling again, and rinse and repeat. Don't see any value here, in all honesty. Looter's Instincts, then, I've got 5 out of 5 here, and I think I would keep that. That's definitely not a regret for me. Revealing loot faster is always going to be a plus, right? In a looter extraction shooter, it just makes sense to reveal stuff quicker. Making less noise as well when looting, I think, is super useful. I haven't A/B tested it as such, so I don't know how much noise reduction there is. But again, if you're going to commit to the survival tree and go further up, you need to spend the points somewhere. And I think this is much better use of the points as opposed to the revitalizing squat option. So we take 5 out of 5 here. Of course, it is useful for reducing the noise that players can hear you by, and also Arc as well in certain capacities or certain areas. You know, thinking like Blue Gate is an outdoor map that has breachable husks and areas and containers that you can loot on the outdoors, and having quieter looting just means that they're less likely to come and aggro you based on the noise you're making. So I think that's super useful. And then, of course, in-round crafting. I think this is a no-brainer, but let me know in the comments on how we can path to this, because I'm not sure if you have to take the one revitalizing squat point or not to get to it. My idea is if you take 5 Agile Croucher, 5 Looter's Instincts, 5 Silent Scavenger, Suffer in Silence as your 16th point, move into Traveling Tinkerer, down again to Good as New, and then down to in-round crafting, you can ultimately avoid this unnecessary point in revitalizing squat, as it looks like the tree can be connected from the top half rather than that side of the tree. But I haven't tested this. I don't know if it's possible. If you know in the comments, then please do let me know, because I do think saving that point could be quite useful elsewhere. So if we can go that way, then that's the way I would go. But Suffer in Silence, while critically hurt, movement makes less noise. Again, it's maybe super situational, but it's a point that if you're working towards security breach or Minesweeper on the tree, it makes sense to take it. I think having that ability to reposition effectively with less noise, especially in, say, Stella Montis map, as that's heavily PvP focused, or just in tight areas for PvP, I think that's definitely very useful. And then, of course, that allows us to unlock the Traveling Tinkerer passive here, which is unlocking additional items to Fieldcraft. I'm not sure how much benefit I've got from this in my 71 hours topside, honestly. I think it unlocks things like traps and noisemakers and other things that you can craft, and I'm not sure I've crafted one of them, to be honest. But again, looking at the other passives, I'm not sure that I would spend the point elsewhere, and of course I would like to get to Good as New anyway, so Traveling Tinkerer makes sense. More items to craft is probably never a bad thing anyway, right? And then Good as New, while under a healing effect, stamina regeneration is increased. So again, as I mentioned earlier with revitalizing squat, stamina regeneration on its own, or requiring you to do something to get the stamina regeneration, kind of doesn't make sense on its own. But because we're going to be healing a lot and we get stamina regen passively as part of the healing, to me that makes sense. That's a no-brainer, right? If you're running away from arc, if you've got PvP engagement, you use a bandage and you're going to get regen stamina from just using the one quick use item as opposed to a bandage and an adrenaline shot. That feels good to me. Then moving into Stubborn Mule, I think this is one of the first mistakes that I made. 5 out of 5 here. Stamina regen being less affected by being over encumbered, I would say, is not valuable enough to take 5 points away from the rest of the tree. Simple reason is, again, the same as revitalizing squat. Stamina regeneration can just be resolved with an adrenaline shot, and also being over encumbered in general, we don't aim to do that on purpose, right? There are certain scenarios where you might feel the need to, but in the end, once you get to a certain point in this game and you've got enough economy to I guess, last you, you can just throw that excess weapon or something that's bogging you down on the floor, right? You don't need to absolutely carry everything that you find back. So I think it makes sense to skip those 5 points, honestly, and spend them elsewhere. So where would I put them? Well, certainly 4 of the 5 points would go into one Raider's scraps. As remember, we must keep the 36 points in order to obtain security breach as the 37th point. So I would definitely take 4 out of Stubborn Mule and put them into one Raider's scraps instead. When looting Raider containers, having that small chance to find an additional craftable item sounds good to me. It's just passive freebies like bandages and shield recharges that possibly could help us, especially when you're deep into raids, right? If you spend your time topside beyond, say, the 20-minute mark, you've got 10 minutes remaining, and you're still running around looting. Sometimes on certain map conditions or certain scenarios, you might find yourself a bit sparse on healing and stuff like that. So having the ability to find those additional items rather than just craft them, I think makes sense to have. Then we've got Broad Shoulders, 5 out of 5 on this one. Again, absolutely would take this again in a heartbeat, because maximum weight is, of course, changed and amended by our augments in our loadouts. But having the maximum weight here from a passive perspective also affects free loadouts as well. It's just your overall Raider carry capacity, which can be useful if you want to, I don't know, engage some free loadout PvP in Stella Montis, for example. Having that extra weight is super useful. So we'd definitely take that again. And the same for Looter's Luck here. Having a chance to reveal twice as many items at once alongside the speed, the Looter's Instincts, could be really, really useful, especially, again, as we're kind of in our, I don't know, high 30s at this point, I guess, in terms of level. If we decide to go survival only in our early days, having the ability to reveal more loot twice as quickly and having twice the items be revealed twice as quickly from time to time, it's a no-brainer. And then, of course, the famous security breach. I think personally that I would still take this even post-nerf. For me, none of the other notables at the end of the trees are valuable enough in the current state of the tree. I think having an additional huge raider container to ultimately unlock every single map, of course, depends on when you load in, if you know the locations, but once you understand where to go and whether to prioritize them or not in certain situations, you can really come away with some nice loot from these still. I'm still finding wolf packs, I'm still finding blueprints, I'm still finding blue and purple weapons from time to time in here. So for me personally, I think this is still great even post-nerf. One point that I might consider taking, although that would take us to 38, would be Minesweeper. I think mines and explosive deployables, as we move further into the game's patches and the game develops and evolves from a meta perspective, I think we might see more players starting to use mines and explosives and certain things to either cover themselves behind doors, maybe even as part of PvP. We already see the jump mines and explosive mines being super useful in Stella Montis. I would just like to see the timing that it takes to disarm them, because I'm not sure if it's the same as when you disarm your own trap. If so, maybe it leaves you in a vulnerable position anyway, right? If you're going to walk up to a jolt mine and disarm it, if somebody's in the sort of camping or waiting in the wings anyway, they're going to shoot you. So maybe it's not useful, but something to consider. And of course, we do still have a few points to think about here. If we're only using the additional 4 in one Raider's scraps, of course, after removing the 5 from Stubborn Mule and the 1 from Revitalizing Squat, I think if my maths are correct, that would leave us with about 2 points remaining. So maybe I would take 1 in Stubborn Mule and 1 in 3 Deep Breaths, just to have them as small passives, just to effectively as fillers, right? Because we've maxed out everything else that we like to get to Security Breach. So that's one possibility that I would do. But again, that is super dependent on this pathway being possible, if we can go top to bottom rather than coming up this right-hand side path here. So that's survival. I think very happy with the 37 survival build. But as I say, a few tweaks and changes that I would make personally. Then we can look at mobility next. So here I opted to spend 20 points. Of course, this is subject to kind of preference, I guess. I definitely think that more notables in the conditioning tree are maybe more useful higher up, and I would possibly take maybe 1 point out of mobility here in the sturdy ankles point, which we'll get to shortly, to come here. With the additional 5 points that we get from the expedition, then potentially I would just go further up the conditioning tree and just keep the 20 in mobility, maybe even just the 16 to carry the momentum. But let's kick off first of all with Nimble Climber. So climbing and vaulting more quickly. Haven't done any A/B testing on this, but I opted to use 3 out of 5 points here. Maybe 1 is enough. I'm not too sure. Sound out in the comments on what you've opted to do, but I just chose this as a middle ground. On the right-hand side, we have Slip and Slide. Again, I'm not 100% sure how further and faster I can slide. It's a nice stopgap in between sprinting on certain areas of the map, like down battlegrounds when it's obvious to slide. It's quite good to almost as a free mini adrenaline shot, right, where you can just simply slide and gather that extra stamina to continue your momentum and carry on sprinting at the end of it. But realistically, again, similar to the whole stamina regeneration points that we spoke about in survival, I'm not sure that's justifying enough to put 5 points in here. Maybe we could just use adrenaline shots again to top ourselves up, and we don't need to use the slip and slide as much. And that means then we can just stick to Marathon Runner, Youthful Lungs, being fantastic. I definitely think these are great passives. Moving around costing less stamina just makes sense. And of course, increasing max stamina also is going to be super useful in every single scenario and every single raid. So maybe I would change this to 5 out of 5 here, 5 out of 5 and 5 out of 5, giving us the 15 points to then be able to go into carry the momentum, which is after a sprint dodge roll. Sprinting doesn't consume stamina for a short time, and it has a cooldown between uses. So this, again, I haven't A/B tested it, but I do find it useful that once you do sprint dodge roll, having that small window to be able to sprint without consumption of stamina feels like a nice offset. So the sprint dodge roll does cost a substantial amount of stamina, but then having the added benefit of sprinting not consuming it feels good. So I definitely would keep carry the momentum, but I would maybe stop here in terms of mobility, because the rest of these passives then aren't maybe as powerful. So if we have a look here, effortless roll, this is only a dodge roll costing less stamina. At least the wording states that. I don't know if this applies to sprint dodge roll as well. If it does, then maybe that additional 5 points here to benefit carry the momentum even more would make sense, because if you can reduce the sprint dodge roll stamina cost and then get free sprinting at the end of it too, that sounds like a very, very good synergistic combo. But in terms of dodge rolls without sprint dodge roll being worded here specifically, I don't know if this is beneficial. And the same for heroic leap, sprint dodge rolling further. There's not really any scenarios where I've sprint dodge rolled and felt like I didn't get far enough or I wanted more distance. And again, I think this is such a minimal amount of distance added that those 5 points are probably better used elsewhere. So not one for me personally. And if we go to the right side of the tree again, as we mentioned, slip and slide, I would probably take those 5 points away. Sturdy ankles, again, there's ways to mitigate this without taking passive points or at the cost of passive points. So falling from a non-lethal height, you'll take less damage. If you are aware, you can use a very, very timely roll to prevent yourself from taking damage. And of course, that would mean that this passive basically doesn't do anything. So for me personally, I think this is a no-go, and potentially even calming stroll as well while walking. Your stamina regenerates as if you were standing still. Again, we're talking about stamina regeneration. Not sure I find this beneficial with the adrenaline shots in the game. Then moving up to crawl before you walk, I opted not to choose any here. When downed, you crawl faster. Potentially could be useful if you run the looting Mark III Survivor version. Augment quite often, which is the, if you didn't know the name of it, it's the augment that allows you to recover 75% of your health if you stand still or kind of lay still effectively while you're waiting for your health to regenerate. Then of course that means if you're crawling for a long distance to be able to try and extract while benefiting from that augment, crawling faster might help you stop-start a little bit less. I think that could be somewhat useful. Would I spend 5 points in it right now? Probably not. But there are some other synergies in conditioning, which we'll talk about soon, that might help that. Off the wall leap further. I'm not sure I've even done a wall leap, to be honest. I don't even know what that is. And if that is jumping off of an area where you've caught the wall, I'm not sure. But again, I don't really feel that this is necessary. I'm not parkouring too much in this game. Maybe ready to roll in order to benefit from that. You'd need to take the 1 point here. Potentially, when falling, your timing window to perform a recovery roll is increased. Maybe that's useful, giving you less room for error, I suppose, to perform that roll that we spoke about earlier with fall damage. But honestly, spending 5 points here or even one, I don't know. I'm not too sure about this either. I'm not convinced on this passive. Vigorous vaulter. Vaulting is no longer slowed down while exhausted. Again, super niche. Not sure how much vaulting people are doing in their runs, but for me personally, I avoid it unless it's absolutely necessary. You can just run around a lot of areas for the most part. I mean, even Blue Gate, with as many rocks and kind of scrambling opportunities that there are in that map, you can still kind of get around in different ways, and having it slowed down while being exhausted, just again, pop an adrenaline shot, then you're no longer exhausted, you'll vault faster, therefore don't need to spend the point. But only costing 1 point, maybe it's okay. Heroic Leap we've covered, and then of course the last two, the final two ends of the tree being vaults on vaults on vaults, no longer costing stamina. Again, maybe that could be useful if you are parkouring a little bit more, if you're running around those outdoor zones and using it more potentially. But at what cost are we really getting this for? I mean, it's 36 points in mobility first. So 30, you'd need to commit to the 37 tree just to get this alone. And again, I don't think there's enough notables here that would make this beneficial. I still think Security Breach outweighs that. And same for Vault Spring, letting you jump at the end of a vault. I'm not sure again that I would see any use condition for this. But again, this is purely subjective. You guys let me know in the comments if you feel differently. But I think 20 in mobility is probably more than enough. Maybe a little bit more, given the fact that we have some extra points to spend on the expedition. And then finally, conditioning. This is definitely my second favourite tree, because it just has more useful tools in it, in my opinion, than mobility. But I wouldn't maybe commit all the way, as we'll talk about now. So first of all, we've got used to the weight. Wearing a shield doesn't slow you down as much. Now, this is super important to remember, that The weight penalty only applies to medium and heavy shields. If I just go to my inventory real quick and check some shields, hopefully I've got a few. Okay, yeah, so heavy shield. We can see as we hover this, 15% reduced movement speed at the bottom of the tooltip there, while a medium shield gives you a 5% reduction penalty, whereas a light shield doesn't give you any penalty whatsoever. So it's worth noting that, as far as I understand, this use to the weight passive would not benefit you if you primarily run with a light shield. If you're running mediums and heavies more often, then I would say 5 out of 5 on this makes sense, because it coincides well with, of course, your broad shoulders, the maximum weight being carryable, the epic augments as well, especially the looter ones, I think probably allowing you even as high as 70, I think, if I remember well, on the looter Mark 3s. So this makes sense because it means you can carry more things out of any given raid. Then we move on to the right hand side here, gentle pressure, making less noise when breaching. Very, very synergistic with the less noise when looting. So these two things combined I think are super useful, again, to avoid PvP and Arc in certain scenarios. Proficient Prior next then, 5 out of 5 here for breaching doors and containers taking less time. I found this super useful. Again, it's quite difficult to pan the camera in certain scenarios when you're breaching doors to check behind you and what's going on. So just having less time to breach those doors and even containers in some scenarios is going to be useful. The more containers we open, the more doors we can open, the quicker we get around the map. Of course, that's going to be more beneficial, right? So definitely recommend taking 5 out of 5 here. That then leads us into Unburdened Roll. I would say in order to obtain this passive, you can go 3 out of 5 here and then 1 point for these two if you wish. You could take, again, primarily 1 out of 5 on the use of the weight passive for light shields and maybe spend a bit more here, but we'll talk about that in a second as to why I haven't opted to do that. But certainly, again, it's subjective and up to you. But if your shield breaks with Unburdened Roll, your first dodge roll within a few seconds, not costing stamina, again, is really, really good. If that doesn't apply to the sprint dodge roll, but again, I think in terms of reaction times, if your shield is breaking through arc damage or from PvP, having that maneuverability and ability to position ourselves or reposition ourselves with the no cost of stamina, I think makes sense to take as one single notable skill point. So I recommend certainly taking Unburdened Roll. And then these two smaller passives, Blastborn first, about hearing being less affected by explosions. I think that, again, is super subjective. For me personally, even the 1 out of 5, I'm not sure is even noticeable, to be honest. So I'm not sure I would retake that. But again, you can opt to take a little bit more into that if you think that you personally get affected by explosions and your ability to hear around you, given that circumstance. And the same for Fight or Flight. When you're hurt in combat, regain a fixed amount of stamina, and it has a cooldown between uses. Even though I've taken 1 point here, I would definitely opt more, I think, to go down the right-hand side of the tree, or up the right-hand side of the tree, should I say, over to the little extra and then down to Survivor's Stamina, rather than trying to get up the left-hand side, if that's possible. Again, I'm not sure, as we spoke about, similar with the survival tree, if you can go to this node here and then down again. If you can go to this node and then down again here, that's the route that I would take. I would not go up the left-hand side to get either of these points. Again, I just think anything related to stamina regeneration can be fixed with adrenaline shots, so I don't recommend that at all. Then Survivor's Stamina. When you're critically hurt, your stamina regenerates faster. We've just spoken about stamina regeneration, yes, but again, this is something that if you're critically hurt, having a free ability to be able to regenerate stamina allows you to reposition well. You don't have to focus on using adrenaline shot in that moment. You could instead use a Vita Spray or a bandage to be able to get yourself out of that critical hurt condition while being able to sprint and reposition for further distances because your stamina regen has increased. So I think this makes sense to take as opposed to just effectively fixing regaining a fixed amount of stamina or additional stamina regeneration while crouching. I think this notable is an example of what I would like to see more of in terms of stamina regeneration. It's a secondary point rather than the primary point, so definitely recommend taking this. Then we go into a little extra. Breaching an object generates resources. This can be absolutely anything from a husk to a door to a raider container. Anything that requires breaching will give you those small resources. The interaction is a little bit strange until you get used to it, but ultimately once you've finished breaching whatever you need to breach, there is an item that drops to the ground. So if I take an example of husks, you actually gain arc alloys. Arc alloys are useful from a crafting perspective, right? They turn into arc motion cores for wolf packs and all sorts of other uses. So having those, especially during trial runs for opening husks, you can gather an extremely large amount of arc alloy just by having this a little extra passive. I think it's about 2 or 3 at a time that get dropped for each breach, so quite a lot. For the doors, it's like metal parts and smaller craftable loot, so maybe not as impactful for that, but certainly for the husks I've noticed a big difference after taking this. And really that just unlocks the point to be able to get us to loaded arms, which again is super useful when we talk about how the weight affects our loadouts. Equipped weapon having less impact on your overall encumbrance, I think it means on the overall weight and loadout as well. So that means of course you gain more benefit from broad shoulders. You have this synergistic point on the other side of the tree that allows us to have less impact on our weight by equipping our 2 weapons or 1 weapon in our loadout. So super useful there. With these extra 5 points then, what would I do and how would I allocate them? Potentially, as I said, I would take a little bit more points out of mobility and maybe go further up the conditioning tree. Definitely would avoid, I think, still this right-hand side here for reasons that I think are quite obvious. Effortless swing, melee abilities costing less stamina. Super, super situational. Unless you're meleeing people to death or, you know, even trying to melee arc in certain conditions. Having it cost less stamina doesn't really appeal to me. You should be shooting these things. You should be PvPing with guns, right? It's just a final swing sometimes that you'll finish somebody off when you're reloading. And again, I don't see that costing less stamina as being a huge benefit, especially for 5 points. So effortless swing is an avoid for me. Same for sky clearing swing as well, dealing more melee damage to drones. I mean, unless you're jumping onto a drone regularly and swinging at it to kill it, I don't see any reason why you would do this. Shooting out the engines to bring them to the floor anyway results in a crash, a bang, and a death of the drone. You don't need to walk up to it and start meleeing it to kill it. So again, don't see any value in using any points here. And the same for fly swatter. How many of you are using melee attacks to kill wasps? I don't know. Turrets, there's only 1 turret that I'm aware of that you can melee attack quite comfortably, and that's on Damn Battlegrounds over at the Breach. There is an achievement on Steam, maybe a trophy on PlayStation as well, where you go and effectively swing about 5 times to kill the turret that sat on the top of the this kind of ramp area. There's no other turrets that I can imagine us swinging at to be able to gain this to gain any value from this point, in all honesty. So definitely would avoid the fly swatter route. Then on the left-hand side is probably where I would maybe spend more points. Maybe we have some synergy here with the down but determined and crawl before you walk passives. So if we did take crawl before you walk, when you're downed you crawl faster. When you're downed you crawl faster, and then also having the ability to take longer before you actually collapse could be super synergistic. Again, if you're a looting Mark III survivor, regular loadout runner, potentially these 2 things together could make a lot of sense. But again, if we're talking about extra 5 points and then maybe even removing the 2 points here, maybe some in mobility and redistributing them slightly, I would probably max out use to the weight for the medium and heavy shield runs. Maybe 5 out of 5 in the down but determined could be useful even in squads, duos and of course trios. Could be useful to allow your teammates to get to you and of course revive you. Turtle crawl, again, while downed you take less damage, probably relating more to anyone who's taking, let's say, shrapnel damage almost while they're downed. I don't think this is going to be super valuable for weapon damage as such. If somebody wants to kill you with a weapon, I think 1 clip's probably going to do enough damage to you once you're downed to completely finish you off. And of course you have the knockout option as well, maybe more relevant in solos, the knockout option as opposed to squads. But honestly, I don't see any reason why I would take the turtle crawl. So potentially would avoid this point here. And then finally, back on your feet. When you're critically hurt, your health regenerates until a certain limit. Maybe this is useful. I could see, again, some scenarios where once you reach a really damaged health state, having free health regeneration could be useful. It means you could probably focus on regenerating your shield first, allowing your health to regenerate until that limit, and then popping your bandage. could get you up to full health with maybe just one herbal bandage or sterilized bandage. I'm not too sure where the limit is in terms of the health bar, but could be useful. Again, it's just worth noting that all of these passives that we've spoken about on the other trees require that 36 point investment. And I think that's where I struggle to not justify security breach even post nerf, because none of these trees offer enough outside of the largest notables, and even those are not great, right? Let's be honest, to invest in so many points on the other sides of the tree. So although I like the system, I'm not too sure that I agree that it's balanced right now. I still think survival is heavily favored. Maybe that changes in the new season. But again, guys, thank you very much for watching. Please consider subscribing to the channel. I'm creating as much content as possible around Outgraders as I can, and I'd really like your support to be able to continue to grow the channel and inspire me to make more content, let's say. So thank you very much for tuning in. I hope it was useful for you guys. Let me know in the comments what you found useful, what else that you would like to see me produce, and I will see you guys in the next one.